Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon. This podcast work that I've taken on happily and for so many episodes just keeps bringing me great treasures of new explanations, if you will, new finds of what practice is. Probing the nature of practice is what I'm doing. And this conversation with Brandon Kliewer makes me so happy about the future for this young academic, a non-traditional academic, I guess we could still call him, there at Kansas State University, but also the whole investigation of practice that he is now involved in with looking at leadership as shared practice, not just one person. So why do I keep rambling when you can hear a great guy having a lot of impact on me in the 30 or so minutes that we talk? So here's Brandon. Well, folks, since I started this journey with Peter Vale almost 3 years ago, following my intrigue about the nature of practice, down, up, down, and around through very many conversations, attending virtual meetings, thank you, Zoom, tracking down who's doing some sort of real forward thinking about any aspect of practice. And certainly leadership is a huge aspect of practice. I first talked to Joe Rayland, who knew Peter quite well. And then I followed Joe for a while, and I see now that he has brought together a very interesting group of people globally who look at leadership as practice writ large across a spectrum of people behaving in a particular moment, and hosting a wonderful discussion group looking at some of the publications in leadership as practice is Brandon Kliewer. Did I pronounce that correctly, Brandon?
That was correct, Dave.
And Brandon, because you have a wonderful title, longer than my short-term memory will allow. Tell us your position there in Kansas.
Of course, and thank you, Dave, for having me on the podcast. I'm glad to be here and have this conversation with you. But I'm an associate professor of civic leadership at the Staley School of Leadership Studies at Kansas State University.
Now, that gives me the first clue of what I want to ask, because I think I'd like to really know more about you than just what you're doing and hosting these meetings, which are terrific. And you're doing some wonderful pre-reading and setting up some nice, simple slides for us, so that those of us who didn't quite get the reading done well, you do a beautiful synopsis. I was very impressed with that. But civic leadership, if you would take that back into your history, where did you make that first connection with the civic aspect of anything, but particularly leadership?
Yeah, well, I'm traditionally trained as a political scientist and interested in theories of democracy and the role of citizens and civic engagement in influencing institutions. And so for me, I was always interested in different forms of deliberative and participatory forms of democracy and the role of citizens in that work. And, one of the things that I think I started down this path that got me here to leadership as practice from a kind of civic perspective is that, also in political theory and, most theories of democracy, it does start I think from the perspective of the individual. And I think that has to do with our, Western political philosophy and different traditions that we draw on our contemporary political thought. But one of the things that I realized when doing some of this civic engagement and community engaged scholarship work is that it wasn't just the individual that was interesting. It was the interconnections, the networks, the co-emerged, the co-created and realized that I didn't really have a framework to make sense of those aspects. And so, in my early days, I was doing a lot of community and organization development work, both, for nonprofits, for government, for for-profit companies, and realized that, when listening to the challenges that these organizations faced, it typically wasn't a skill issue for, the collective individuals. It was their collective capacity as an organization to make progress on difficult challenges and make sense and move through complexity. And so I had this sense that we needed new frameworks and new paradigms to think about leadership development and organization development. And that's what led me to this path of leadership as practice and practice theory more generally.
How did you migrate to your particular university? Were you from the area originally, and then what is the mission really of the department that's supporting you as an associate professor?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think part of that is when I was coming up through graduate school, I had the fortunate opportunity to go to Virginia Tech and the University of Georgia. And so a lot of my graduate training was embedded within what we might call campus community partnerships or community engagement, outreach and extension. And that, I think, exposed me to, in my mind, the role that land grants have in a democracy, and the larger civic purpose of a land grant university to try to make progress on the grand challenges facing our states, our countries, and the world. And so, that DNA of the land grant was, I think, built into my studies and my research interests. And so I actually did a postdoc at the University of Georgia after I completed my PhD in outreach and extension that was focused on doing some work related to entrepreneurship-led economic development and working with the Journal of Higher Education and Outreach and Engagement, the journal that they host there. And then I ended up at a regional university down in Southwest Florida, Florida Gulf Coast University, and I directed their civic engagement program, where we had a course called the Foundations of Civic Engagement, where students did community engaged work with nonprofits trying to make progress on a range of issues. And when I was down at FGCU, one of the things that I had gotten connected to while I was in Georgia was Points of Light.
I know it well. Yeah.
Yep. So Points of Light at the time was the world's largest nonprofit devoted to volunteer service. And so I was actually flying back and forth from Fort Myers to Atlanta in those years, which ironically, the flight was sometimes quicker than some of my colleagues that had to fight the Atlanta traffic.
The notorious Atlanta traffic.
Exactly. And so I enjoyed those experiences and did some work with them on thinking on how could we do some of this community engaged learning through various online, platforms. And so we're getting to how I got connected to the Staley School. So
keep going. It's a great story. I'll tell you a couple of coincidences when you get to the point of telling about the Staley School.
So while I was doing this work at Points of Light, one of the things that kind of surfaced was we were trying to find, university partners. And one of the things that came up at the time was Points of Light had a program called the Hands-On Network, which was essentially volunteer resource centers that were focused on rural communities, trying to help increase the capacity for volunteer service and volunteerism. And in that process, one of the Points of Light folks said, "Oh, well, I know, Kansas State University, they're one of our, only hands-on affiliates that is at a university. We should, bring them into this conversation." And so at the time, I knew of K-State, but I didn't really know much of the Staley School and what their mission and vision and purpose was. And so by getting connected to the Staley School through Points of Light, I quickly learned that the Staley School has a really big commitment to leadership and engagement. And we think of that as the larger purposes of higher ed. We are an undergraduate minor that serves every college on campus. We also have an interdisciplinary PhD program that spans multiple colleges, with the idea that when we think about leadership communication, it's inherently an interdisciplinary effort. And what makes both of our, or really all of our academic programs, I think unique and different and aligned with my vision for leadership studies and higher ed, is that they're all engaged in the sense that our students are trying to make progress on real world issues. So, obviously we read theory, we read research articles, but all with the purpose of preparing our students, whether they be undergrads or graduate students, to try to make progress on real world issues. And we do that. We have a global food systems leadership program where we have students that think about leadership activity through the lens of global food systems. In our minor, we find that students come to our programs. They might be, an engineer, a business student, an English student, but they all have some interest in, what we might call civic issues, or understanding how their learning and development can impact bigger purposes. And so that's what really drew me to the Staley School. I've been here for 8 years. I actually received tenure the weekend before March 2020, when we all went on lockdown. So wow, it was right before then. And so I'm really excited to be here. And there's a lot of energy at Kansas State University around leadership and engagement. And I think that's what keeps me here, keeps me energized. And it's always fun to work with graduate students and undergraduate students that, share an understanding that higher education has a bigger purpose, and trying to pursue that civic minded pursuit.
Wow. Well, first, I wish I wasn't almost 80. I wish I were following you along your track. And even though I was a sociology major as an undergrad, the political sciences and all those things that you mentioned would be much in the way my head works too. So it isn't all about me. It is about you, Brandon, but it's a terrific story. And a couple of quick connections. One, when you were down there in Florida, did you know Eric Dent?
Eric Dent, the name
at that school.
Yeah, at FGCU, the name sounds familiar, but I don't know if we crossed paths. What department was Eric in?
He's in management in the School of Business, I believe, but his focus is on ethics and community and the moral aspects of community leadership. He was a student of Peter Vale's at George Washington University, and really, really cared about Peter a lot, and wrote a couple of beautiful articles and chapters about Peter Vale. So I connected with Eric very early in my journey of finding initially people who knew Peter, and then eventually people who had a passion for practice, which you clearly do. That's one connection. Secondly, I think when we were waiting for starting one of our leadership reading meetings, I mentioned to you that I had been involved with our Small Town America Civic Volunteer Award Program funded by Civic Plus. And you said, wait a minute, they're just down the road.
Of course.
That was another coincidence. This is very strange how that happens. And then the co-principal of Barton Russell Group, Ken Sternad, had been the vice president and president of the Foundation for UPS and a number of things. And when he went into retirement, living there in Atlanta, he was on the board of Points of Light. Mm-hmm. When we started the award, Points of Light was one of our co-sponsors.
Oh, really? Okay. So
I got the peek at the wonders of Points of Light, and it's tremendous. One of the things they do is they recognize a volunteer every day, which I think is great. Individual volunteers, but then they talk about their setting and how does it that they became successful in that particular endeavor. So that's another coincidence. And I think I could throw in two or three more, but I think for a good phase of my career, I was a community educator, initially a fellow with the Mott Foundation in the 60s, where we studied the community school concept. But when I finished my doctorate at University of Connecticut, with Peter Vail as my main mentor, I went into higher education, community education, by moving back to my home state of Maine and instituting a division of public service for one of the branch campuses, not for the land-grant campus, out in the Western Mountains. And I worked hard at that, and I raised, among other things, almost $1 million of Kellogg money, Kellogg Foundation money, to support health education of the public. That was our mission in the 70s and early 80s, and a number of other things. All of that work was terrific, and it all had to do with convening people from diverse connections to whatever the theme, particularly in health education. When we wrote the Kellogg grant, we had everything from the medical association and the major hospitals to the rural hospitals. Then we had a lot of people, just people who didn't want to get sick. And so it was a wonderful convening. And so when our proposal went into Kellogg, they were stunned at how much engagement Maine people were having for our little tiny campus. Maybe we had 1,100 students at best, around this idea of getting at the learning aspects of health stability and betterment, as opposed to the medical and the other kinds of ways that people were being treated after the fact. So that was a hell of a period of time for me, but we just couldn't sustain it with grants. And so I went to my other love, which is teaching organization behavior. And then the rest of my career was teaching. But in the meantime, though, I've never lost my belief in what a group of people can do at the grassroots, as we used to call them before you were born, my son, grassroots. And I worked grassroots. I worked them hard. And even as a professor, when you talk about partnerships, I was working to foster partnerships in healthcare. We had a big partnership with the Travelers Corporation, so that my students, who were grassroots people in my regional campus, most of them had no family, had been to college, could get their voices heard, to get to the table before they graduated, so that they could come out energized and confident, more than what could create in a classroom or at a library. So yeah, you and I are sort of, I think we're soul grandfather, grandson. When you need the support of your school and the university totally to move into new directions, like you are now with leadership as practice, do they get it? Is it clear, or do you have to be a bit of a guy on the frontier, calling the wagons in? Come on, it's okay. It's safe out here now.
Yeah. Well, I think, we have a very unique school with a wide mission, right? So we're not all actually faculty. We have a lot of programs as well. So we have both staff and faculty that are advancing the mission. And so I think one of the benefits of that is we have a big tent. I think one of the roles that our research and tenure track faculty have is to try to, conduct research and bring the leading edge ideas into the school and introduce them, right? And I think we might call this maybe adaptive space or a space in which innovations trying to be, percolate. And I think in some ways our institution sees some of the work at the Staley School as that, ecosystem of innovation that's taking place, at least through the lens of, leadership, learning, and development. Our organization is actually, we report to the provost. So we exist under the provost. Our tenure lines are actually in the College of Education. Mm-hmm. But I think one of the reasons and rationale for that organizational structure is that, we want to try to be a resource for the entire university. Mm-hmm. And it's not necessarily just about a commitment to a discipline or guiding questions that are connected to a disciplinary lens, but instead, the role leadership and engagement has in making progress on pressing challenges. And so, for us, being situated in Kansas, we have a lot of people that are very interested in global food systems. Mm-hmm. Increasingly, we have folks that are interested in what we might call community vitality, community development, or entrepreneurship-led economic development, especially for some of our rural communities in Kansas.
Very much needed. Very much needed. Yeah.
And I think in some ways that's why it's important to me that I have that civic in front of the lens of leadership. So if I were to talk about my research interests, I would say that, I'm interested in leadership in organizations and community for the purposes of democracy. But in a title, I think the language of civic is important to me because the way that I operationalize that, and I think many at the school think of civic is the social, political, economic, and moral spheres of society.
Yeah.
And so, when I think about the courses I teach and the research agenda that I'm advancing, in some ways it exists, and how do we move through those spheres productively and try to understand what engagement looks like in those various spheres to make progress on challenges. And increasingly the practice lens is what's informing, that framework, right? How do we create productive disagreements? How do we understand interactions in ways that are culturally responsive? How do we move through systems and understand the impact of systems in ways that impact people differently depending on their social location, right? And I think those are questions that guide my teaching, my research, and a lot of the work at the Staley School.
Damn, I tried to build that kind of thing when I called it the Public Service Division. I should never use the word division. That was the first mistake as I'm looking back on it. No, that is almost exactly why I chose to do that right after I finished my doctorate, partly because I really needed to be back in Maine for my family, but also I felt in Maine, since that's how I grew up, we didn't know better than to walk into with appointments into any office, whether it's the governor or the president of a bank, and say, "I'm Dave. Let's talk. Let's do some business." It was for a period of time, it was an easy place to be anywhere. Mm-hmm. You didn't really feel that you didn't belong, and that's partly why I wanted my kids to experience that in a small town in Maine when they were in their growing up time, and it's helped them ever since. But my point is that we had organized around the major issues confronting families and small businesses in Maine, not us as researchers. So when energy crisis in the 70s hit, we developed an energy solution with a couple of faculty who had some really cool ideas and well-grounded ideas. And then we raised the money to go after it. When I mentioned the health education, we had the worst health statistics you could imagine out in that county. And so we felt that the main problem was behavioral. So we attacked that. And I work with the Cooperative Extension Service, by the way, and anyone else who I could work with. But I felt over the years that maybe because I was moving away from directly with that work, that we kept coming up again and again with the almost requirement that at least universities and colleges having, that a faculty member needed to be in a spot, in a niche, nailed down, and do the work specifically that people understood within that niche. And I was bombing all around my campus here, where the last 30 years I was working at a regional campus. I would make relationships with any department on campus, 15,000 students. So it was a lot of people and saying, well, let's, come in, let's connect, let's get some real energy going. And then, but you're in the business school. What are you doing over here?
Yeah.
Well, I'll show you my liberal arts credential. No, so there's that. I don't know if it's a default system. Hopefully it's going away, but what's your perspective? Because you seem to have found a place that has figured out, at least through some power arrangement, that you can move around freely in the cabin of civic life and study as you think is needed.
Yeah, and I think, though, that's unique to Kansas State University and the Staley School. We have a really big commitment to leadership and engagement. And the way that we often talk about that is through the lens of community engaged scholarship. And I know that is not the case, even at other colleges and departments at my own campus, right? A lot of folks that are coming from a more traditional disciplinary lens, their tenure and promotion guidelines still expect them to meet certain metrics and publish in certain journals. And oftentimes what that means is they have to let theory guide their research paradigm and the questions they ask. Whereas, what's unique about the leadership communication PhD program and our commitments at the Staley School is that we want partnership to guide our questions, right? And oftentimes that partnership informs like specific challenges that people are interested in. And that's typically how we contextualize a lot of our work, both from a perspective of engaged learning, when we have students maybe doing what we might call service learning or engaged learning within a community or organization. We usually try to first start off with partnership as the guiding principle, and then find ways to work with groups, right? And I think that's a different paradigm for a lot of scholars.
Oh, very different. But it seems to me that if I were the scholar that belongs with you guys, that I would want to first find out where the heat is, in the infrared, kind of looking at community and community energies. Whether I'm looking at a corporate for heat or I'm looking at a town or set of towns, I'm looking for heat. I'm looking for where people's concerns are high, either because they are excited and something great's happening, or they're terrified and something horrible's happening. But you go to the heat. Now, I used to say this with my friend at Kellogg, who was a very bright guy. And he said, Dave, problems do not organize themselves by department. He said, problems are problems. And the more perspectives you can get looking at that problem, investigating, the more likely you're going to get solutions. And by the way, solutions is what the foundation wants. Journal articles are nice, but not until you've got some solutions. So I'm getting to the point here. Believe me, I'm getting to the point. When you're out there and you're around where the heat spots are, you say that you identify something that could inform theory, could shake theory and move theory in another direction. Do you have that experience, which in a way you're doing with leadership as practice, to impact theory and theoreticians, the academics who do need to publish and all the rest, but need something fresh?
Yeah, Dave, I think you're spot on there with, that this concept of heat, guiding where community engaged scholars look for work. It reminds me of, the Heifetz's adaptive leadership and the productive zone of disequilibrium. Whereas when I think about a lot of the community engaged scholarship that our graduate students are doing and our research faculty are doing, they're often in that space, right? Maybe they're working with a community that's trying to maybe lower the heat into the productive zone, or they're in a space where there's not enough heat and the group's trying to organize to raise the heat to be a little bit more productive. And so a lot of our research is really process based, right? And I think that's what lends itself to the leadership as practice frame, is that we're really interested in questions of process. And so when we think about leadership and associated research, we're not typically looking at what many would assume is the quote unquote leader or someone occupying a formal role. We're interested in what dynamics of co-emergence are helping groups, organizations, and communities get the right people together to try to make some progress on an issue. And, I think that's what sets this work apart, and our unit and our programs differently than some other programs.
Peter Vale, as I was working on conjecture number 32 of the 32 conjectures in our book, Practice is a Way of Being, in number 32, he was addressing his concerns about just what we're discussing in this conversation, that the academy, the people who make their living with theory, have such a gap from where things actually do happen, that there's a lag between the theory and the new theory and those who can acquire it. And also some very, very difficult ground to cross to get to the theory and practice marriage, or what he called a dance.
Yeah.
But he used two words, which I used just yesterday with a convening that Bowling Green University held. The two sentiments he wrote was: practice delivers, practice is process. So think of that. Practice delivers and practice is process. So if I were looking at a theoretician, I'm saying, okay, let me just follow this very energetic guy, Brandon, out to the field. First, I'd be seeing what is actually getting done. Practice delivers. And who's doing the practicing? Well, it's not just one person. It's a combination of people, but it's delivering. And that's something that is what I used to think of as the last mile in my work. And you get so close, but if you're not really impacting the life of people to the extent that they'll see their way to improvement and change, you haven't made it yet.
Yeah.
So practice delivers. But Peter wrote a lot in his career about process wisdom. Practice is process too. So process is not one person just organizing herself to get something done. It's collective and social, and it's enacted socially. So that, again, if Peter were on this call, and I'm running out of my clock on this for Brandon, but if he were on this call, he'd be going, there, Dave, there. That's what I was talking about right there. What that Staley Stool's doing, what Brandon's doing, what Kansas is benefiting by, what the baskets of ideas that could be coming back to campus and shaking on the table for people who want to propose some conjectures, at least about the nature of anything, can grab a bit here and there, make a salad, make something happen. And that to me was what and to Peter Vale, because he was the dean of that very large business school of business and government at George Washington. He said, that's what we're supposed to be. We're supposed to get out, bring back the messes, as he called it, and make sense out of them, make meaning, teach our students how to do that too, because that's how they're going to survive in the whitewater world. And we could all be very proud of being university people.
Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective, Dave, because, I think going back to your original question around, theory and who makes it and how it's made, I think the traditional model, it's, the grand theorist who sits in the ivory tower and ponders the grand questions. And
stroking the chin.
Yeah, and I think there's a place for that, right? And
right
I think,
thinkers, sure.
Yeah, there's a place for that. But when you take on a community engaged scholarship and a leadership as practice frame, it completely breaks apart that paradigm, right? It values and recognizes a broader range of knowing that is embedded in that process, right? So when we think practice is process, that I think also speaks to this shift to understanding theory and practice differently, that even though the theorizing we do in practice and process might not look like the theory done in a lot of academic journals, it's still there, right? And it's incumbent of the community engaged scholar to create the conditions and processes for that to emerge in the group of people that you're working with, right? And that's the theory building component. And to the logistics of this, Dave, I think as a scholar, I want my methods and theories to be, consistent both in form and philosophy, right? Like the idea that I want methods that develop the capacity of a group to make sense and make meaning of their experience. Mm-hmm. And then in that, I think there's also some ways to make some theoretical contributions that might be of interest to those traditional peer-reviewed articles, right? Those traditional peer-reviewed journals.
Well, two things. While you're working with that group, because you are read in a numbers of different theories, you can offer your perspective and even cite it and help them understand why it's so important to have a scholar in their presence working with them, because you could be gently generous with, this is what so-and-so has said, and this corresponds to what you're doing. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's a give and take. But on the other hand, I will do one more reminiscent, I promise. Well, I can picture a group that we did pull together to create the proposal, if you will, to Kellogg. And I had some doctors and some other sort of official practitioners, if you will, by title in some of these conversations. But I had one person who was I think we call him selectman of a little town called Phillips, who happened to have grown up there and was considered an influential person in Phillips and around the county. So I had him in and we were talking, and everyone was throwing their best big words out there, mm-hmm. almost like a contest to show who was the smartest in the room. And this fellow said, well, could I just ask you to listen to a very brief story? And he told the story, and he told it about some of his relatives who were struggling with alcohol abuse for the early stages of when drugs were coming into the county. Some of the things that were happening he said the oldest living family member is only like 52 because he said, now I've given you a bunch of things. This is my family I'm talking about, and I'm opening up my shirt here to show you from the heart that mm-hmm. we have desperate conditions and we don't have the remedies. And if you can help us with those remedies, I'd be the group everything just changed from that point. Mm-hmm. And we started to ground it. In fact, when we were writing, we said, well, what would Phil say? Is this authentic to what Phil is living here in these conditions and trying to lead a town with a budget of like $12? And mm-hmm. so the voices are so important that they can shape even the theory makers mm-hmm. if we can get access. So yeah, we've we got to do, I don't know how much more of this you could take. I would love to have more of these kind of conversations with you, Brandon, certainly sometimes for the podcast, but you're on such a great footing for a wonderful career. Just terrific career.
Well, I really appreciate that, Dave. I do feel very fortunate to be here at the Staley School around talented colleagues and committed graduate students and undergraduate students that share this commitment to community engaged scholarship and leadership and engagement. So I really appreciate you saying that.
I was thinking, could we do a Freaky Friday thing, and I could become you, and you could become this old guy sitting here living through his computer screen. I just would love to be doing the work that you're doing, and please do it for those of us who can't anymore.
Yeah, well, if you're ever out this way, we'll have to show you around the Staley School and give you a tour of Kansas.
It would be a treat. Thank you so much. Thank you.
No, thank you, Dave. This was a great conversation. I really enjoyed chatting with you.
If you'd like to hear more, listen in on Spotify, Automatic, and Apple Podcasts, or go to inactionresearch.com/podcast-page. And if you'd like to learn more about social inaction and the nature of practice, head over to inactionresearch.com. for more information. Thank you for supporting this show. We look forward to hearing from you soon.